Oh, hi there. It's me, Mr. White, here with the Unit 4 test review. So go ahead and get out your test review. If you don't have the test review, of course, you can download it from my website, www.epsilen.com/Andrew White, as you see right here. Once you get to that website, what you need to do is click on the left-hand side where it says Showcase. You don't need to log in. Just scroll all the way down to the bottom of my showcase. You'll see a PDF file labeled Unit 4 Test Review. That's the one you want to download. So once you do that, just have that out, follow along with me, and be prepared to make a good grade on your Unit 4 test. Alright, here we go. Number 1. What were some accomplishments of the Tang and Song dynasties? Okay, remember Tang and Song dynasties were in China. The main things that they're known for inventing or improving were wood block printing. Also gunpowder, remember they invented that. Paper currency, porcelain, and the magnetic compass. So remember, as long as you hear those things, you see those things, you'll know that it's Tang and Song dynasties. Those are some of their main inventions. Okay, we talked about that in class. Shouldn't be a problem. All right, number 2. How did the Mongol rule in Russia affect Russia's relationship with the rest of Europe? Well, first of all, it put Russia's civilization behind the civilization of Western Europe. And that's why there are so many cultural and social differences between Russia and the other parts of Europe like Germany and Britain and France today. Because of the fact that Russia was part of the Mongol Empire for a while, Germany, Britain, and France were never part of the Mongol Empire. So cultural differences there. Also, the nobles of Russia gained more power over things like taxation. And so that really led the way for this thing called feudalism, which we're going to study in the next unit, so stay tuned. Also, Moscow became the center of political power. And wouldn't you know it, Moscow is still the capital of Russia today. So those are some really good examples of how the Mongol rule affected Russia. Now, number 3. What did Neo-Confucianism emphasize? Well, don't let the Neo part throw you off. Neo-Confucianism is basically like going back to the roots of Confucianism. And so it emphasized the same things as traditional Confucianism. Things like tradition and authority. And also harmony. You know, you want to keep everything balanced and stable. Okay, tradition, authority, harmony. Number 4. What part of the Tang government allowed them to control such a large empire? Well, the Tang government brought back those ideals of Confucianism. And you may remember that one of the main ideals of Confucianism is that education is the most important thing in life. So they brought back the civil service exams. So they were able to recruit the most educated people to work in the government. That helped them keep their big empire together. The other thing was that they reestablished that traditional Chinese bureaucracy. If you forgot what bureaucracy means, it's just those different levels of authority in government or in an organization. Remember I said it's kind of like the way Cy Lakes is set up. And so that helped them keep control over this big empire by having a bureaucracy and also by bringing back the civil service exam. What did footbinding in China show about women? Well, just think about what it says about their status. Men had total control over women. So the practice of footbinding just signaled a further decline in the social status of women. In other words, women weren't gaining any rights and they weren't given any freedoms. Essentially, they were at the lowest levels of society and they always had men telling them what to do. That's what footbinding really showed about women's status. Now, number 6. What do we call the spread of Mongolian influence to other parts of Asia and Europe? If you took world geography, you better remember this term, cultural diffusion. Okay, it's just cultural diffusion when culture spreads from one place to another. Okay. Now, number 7. What technology allowed the Song dynasty to become a strong power at sea? Well, if you did your warm-up yesterday, that was the magnetic compass. Remember? Magnetic compass allowed them to actually sail away from the side of land, so that way they could go farther and discover more. Without that invention, guys like Christopher Columbus would not have been able to make his world-changing journey to the Americas. I don't know, it might have worked out better for the Indians if he hadn't have done that. But see, I wouldn't even call them Indians if it wasn't for Christopher Columbus, so obviously it was important, right? So number 8. What led to the rise of the Mongol Empire? I can think of 3 things. For one, they had great leaders like Genghis Khan. You might remember the video about that guy. He was really smart. He had great military tactics, and he was able to conquer just about everybody he fought. Number 2, The use of technology. Remember we said those things like stirrups on the sides of their saddles gave them more balance and maneuverability and allowed them to do things like shoot an arrow while at full gallop. Not an easy thing to do. And also, excellent horsemanship. I mean, obviously we're talking about stirrups. These guys were great on horseback. And like I told you, back in those days, most armies fought on foot. So if your army was all mounted meaning on horseback, you had a huge height advantage, you had a speed advantage, you had a mobility advantage. So really, there was nobody around who could compete with the Mongols. All right. Now, number 9. How did new technologies aid the Tang and Song dynasties? Well, all those new technologies that we just talked about in question number 1, things like block printing and gunpowder and magnetic compasses and porcelain and paper currency, all of that helped their economic development. And it also helped the growth and spread of Chinese culture, because those things were so powerful and so new that everybody wanted them. And they also wanted to know more about the people who created them. So those technologies helped diffuse Chinese culture, and they helped the economy of the Tang and Song dynasties grow. Number 10. Describe Chinese cultural diffusion during the Tang and Song dynasties. Were we just talking about that? I think so. The cultures that liked Chinese technology and Chinese culture the most were the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Vietnamese. Now, Japan was never conquered by China, but they really admired Chinese culture. However, Korea and Vietnam didn't really have a choice. They had to take on Chinese culture because for a while they were actually conquered by the Chinese and then later by the Mongols. And so that's why so much of the culture between those nations, Japan and Vietnam and Korea and China, seems very similar because at one time or another they were all united. Now, well, I take it back, not Japan. Anyways, moving on. Number 11, what elements of Taoism can be seen in Tang and Song art? The thing about Taoism is it's all about nature and the idea that nature is a reflection of heaven. So the more you try to change nature, the more you're going against heaven and the more problems you're going to have. So that's why in traditional Chinese art, a lot of times they focus on natural themes. Landscapes, meaning just like, pictures of outside. And also animals and other natural settings. Because it goes along with that idea of nature being a reflection of heaven. So it's an emphasis on nature, landscape, animals. All right, that's what we're thinking about for number 11. Number 12, describe trade during the Tang and Song dynasties. Anytime you hear trade when we're talking about ancient China, just think Silk Road. Okay, if you think Silk Road, you can't go wrong. China traded with other nations extensively throughout the Silk Road. And so that's going to be the number one economic driver for ancient China and the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road. All right, now, who was Genghis Khan and what did he do? Well, remember that he was the warlord who united all the tribes of Mongolia. And through going after some of his enemies and some personal vendettas, he ended up creating the largest land empire that has ever existed. So Genghis Khan was that great military leader, came from Mongolia, conquered most of the world, and when he died, he passed on his empire to his 4 sons. And that was why the Mongol Empire was divided into 4 sections eventually. Now, what happened to trade during the Mongolian Empire's rule? And what period of time would have aided that? Okay, the Mongols created peace and safety for travelers. Do you remember that thing called Pax Mongolia? Okay, this made traders on the Silk Road be able to trade more. Let me think I can say that better. It helped increase trade along the Silk Road because it made it safer for people to travel and trade on the Silk Road. And so that's why Pax Mongolica, number 14, was what led to more trade and more economic development of China during the time of Mongol rule. All right, number 15. How did the Mongolian Yuan dynasty affect China? Well, for one thing, they unified China. China had been 3 separate kingdoms for a while, and they brought them back into one country again. The other thing was they preserved the government traditions of the ancient Chinese dynasties. They kept going with the idea of the mandate of heaven. Also, It opened China to more trade. Like we said, they protected the Silk Road and made it easier for merchants to distribute goods all the way to Europe. And the last thing was that they kept separate identity from the Chinese. So the Mongolians, even though they respected Chinese culture, they still maintained their Mongolian heritage. And actually, remember, they kind of discriminated against Chinese people. All right. Number 16. What did the large area controlled by the Tang Empire cause them to do with other civilizations? Well, it led to more contact with different types of people. So, because of the fact that the Tang Dynasty extended all the way out into the far western parts of China, modern-day Central Asia, they had more contact with people from other parts of Asia and even people from as far away as Europe. So that would be led to more contact with different types of people for number 16. So, what kind of currency helped the Song government develop a large-scale commercial economy? Remember, they were the guys who were all about paper money. They were the first ones to make it rain. Okay, paper money. Number 17. All right, number 18. How did Confucianism impact Chinese life and governments? Well, remember that it created that class called the scholar gentry. And in case you forgot what scholar gentry means, it just means educated, rich person, right? Scholar gentry. The other thing was they allowed more social mobility. So people could actually improve their social situation if they worked hard and got an education. And the last thing was it created self-discipline in the rulers, because the rulers who believed in Confucianism believed very strongly in that idea of harmony and also the sense of duty, not only to themselves but to their ancestors and to the traditions of their government. All right, number 19. What political tactics were used by the Mongols in order to control their large empire? Well, one thing they did was they adopted some of the Chinese customs. So, for example, they kept the bureaucracy. The other thing was they allowed foreigners to serve in the government. So this enabled them to take advantage of the best ideas from all over the empire, not just from one certain social class. And the last thing was they tolerated diversity and even allowed some of their local rulers to keep power over their areas. Remember, like we talked about how they gave power to the Russian lords and allowed the Russian lords to collect taxes. That just made it much easier for them to control this big empire, because there's no way that the Mongols could be everywhere at once to keep their people under control. So they had to depend on other people to do that for them. All right, so number 20, how did geography impact China? Well, remember that China has lots of natural borders, like, for example, the Himalaya Mountains and the Talkilmakan Desert in the far western parts of their country. And so that actually prevented people from places like Europe and South Asia from mixing with people from China. And that's why China's culture developed so differently than other parts of Asia and Europe. All right, now number 21. What did the Silk Road do for products and ideas? The Silk Road influenced the spread of products and ideas because it made it easier for people from places like China and Japan and Korea to buy and sell products from people, to sell products to and buy products from people in the Mediterranean region. And so this just contributed to more spread of ideas, more spread of people, spread of cultures and religions, etc., etc. So, yeah, that's what the Silk Road did for products and ideas. Now, what continents would have been impacted by the Mongol influence? Well, primarily it was Asia. That's where the Mongols did most of their conquering. But remember that they moved all the way to the borders of Europe. Remember that they conquered places like Russia, even as far as Poland. So, if anything, you could say Europe and Asia, or Eurasia. Okay. Now, 23. Give some examples of how Chinese were advanced during the post-classical era. They had large cities. That was one thing. Some cities that already had millions of people. The other thing was that they built canals, which I know doesn't seem like that big of an accomplishment, but in the old days, it was really a very technical thing to do. They used paper money, which is something that we're still doing today, so that's pretty advanced. They wore silk, which was sort of the miracle fabric of their time. And they even had paved roads with drainage ditches, not too different from what we use. So those are some of the advanced features of Chinese cities in the classical era, or the post-classical era. Now, there are some questions on the test that come from previous tests. So this is a little bit of review. So let's go over some things that are going to be on this test that you might not have seen since the last test or maybe even Unit 1. So number 24, what change in the way humans acquire food caused a food surplus? Remember, surplus means more than what you need, which eventually led to the creation of civilizations. It was the domestication of plants and animals. That's what led to a food surplus. Once we learned how to control the supply of food, we were able to have more people. And remember that this is something that we call the Neolithic Revolution. So number 25, how did humans get their food during and after the Neolithic Revolution? Pretty simple, we just said it. During and after the Neolithic Revolution, humans learned how to control their food source by domesticating plants and animals, aka they shifted from being hunters and gatherers who were kind of at the mercy of whatever was around them and had to find their food every single day. And they turned into farmers, basically people who know how to control their supply of food so they don't have to move around, and every single day they know where their next meal is coming from because they're growing it. Okay? So it was the shift from being a hunter and gatherer to being a farmer. Number 26. What is a theocracy? And give an example. Well, ancient Egypt was a theocracy because a theocracy means when religious leaders control the government. You may remember that in ancient Egypt, they were ruled by a type of king called a pharaoh. And the pharaoh was special because not only was he the king and the leader of the government, but he was also considered to be a living god. So he was the leader of the religion as well. So that's what we call a theocracy, when religious leaders rule the government. 27. What was Hellenism? Hellenism means Greek culture blended with other Mediterranean cultures like Persian and Egyptian culture. And Hellenism was spread by Alexander the Great. Remember that he conquered all the way to India, and everywhere he went, he spread Greek culture. I think I told you he was the guy who made it cool to be a Greek. So, Hellenism is Greek culture spread by Alexander. All right, 28. Describe the Greek city-states. They were independent. Remember, they all had their own type of government, and they were not connected to each other politically. The other thing about the city-states is that they were fierce rivals. You may remember that Sparta and Athens had a really big rivalry, and they had a war that lasted for 30 years called the Peloponnesian War. And then the last thing was that they had similar language and religion, and that's what made them all Greeks. They believed in the same gods, they used the same alphabet, they more or less spoke the same language with a few little differences. And so even though they were all culturally the same, since they lived in city-states, they weren't politically united. Okay, 29. Who gives the government its power in a democracy? Pretty simple. It's the citizens. Remember that democracy means people rule. So think power to the people. The citizens give the government power in a democracy. All right, number 30. What were some of the accomplishments of Ashoka Maurya? Remember that he was the guy who spread Buddhism. He also built lots of infrastructure like roads. And the most famous thing that we remember him for are his rock pillar edicts. Those were those tall stone pillars that had laws and teachings of Buddhism written on them. And they're still in many parts of India today. So those are the accomplishments of Ashoka Maurya. And 31, according to Confucianism, what is needed in order to have a good government? Remember that the government should be controlled by well-educated men. That was what Confucius thought. That if people are educated, they'll make good decisions, they'll be better rulers. So, well-educated men. That's what he thought that's who he thought should run the government. And last of all, 32. What were some characteristics and accomplishments of the Qin? Remember, Qin is spelled with a Q. Don't let that mess you up. Remember that Emperor Qin standardized coins for China. So they all used the same money. And coins wasn't the only thing he standardized. He also standardized weights and measures. He standardized the language and really gave birth to the type of Chinese writing that is still used today. And also he worked on expanding the Great Wall of China and sort of started the tradition of Chinese emperors building and adding on to the Great Wall. So that is it for the regular questions. I promise you, if you know the answers to those questions, if you understand what those questions are about, there's nothing that you're going to see on this test that will stump you. Now, the one thing that might be a little challenging are the essay questions. So, for on level, you've got two possible choices. Choice number 1 says give 3 examples, positive or negative, of the Mongol impact on Eurasia. We did an assignment with that today. You might remember we said that some of the impacts were things like it created a different culture and different political system in Russia. And that's what made Russia very different from the rest of Europe. Even caused Russia to fall behind Europe a little bit. Something else that was an example of the Mongol impact on Eurasia is that many of the towns that were located in Central Asia, especially in the eastern parts of the Persian Empire, never fully recovered. One example that we talked about was the city of Baghdad, which is a major city today, but never regained its glory that it had before the Mongol impact. And the last thing, one more impact of the Mongols on Eurasia was that they expanded trade, especially along the Silk Road. They made it easier and safer for merchants to transport goods and products, and that helped lots of ideas to spread. For example, the magnetic compass. If it wasn't for the Mongols protecting the Silk Roads, the magnetic compass would have never made its way to Europe, Columbus would have never made his journey, and who knows, we might not even be sitting here today. Okay? Now, for number 2, how does footbinding represent the subjugation of women in Song China? Well, we kind of talked about that already. If you're somebody who can't even walk very well on your own, and you aren't expected to work, you're not allowed to leave the house without permission, you're always under the control of a male member of your family, you don't really have very much freedom. And I think that footbinding is sort of the ultimate metaphor for the lack of freedom that these women had. I think I even told you guys that I think of a bird in a cage when I think about footbinding, because remember that women in China in those days were expected to just be beautiful. They weren't expected to really go anywhere or do anything or think for themselves, because that was a sign of status for the men, that they could just have beautiful wives who were essentially just trophies and were locked up in the house all day long and weren't even allowed to do anything for themselves. Okay? So that's a great example of the subjugation or the holding down of women in Song China. Now, of course, guys, I don't want you to just repeat what I just said. I want you to put it in your own words. And also look through your notes. You might find some other examples in the notes that you want to talk about more than what I had to say. So, that's just right off the top of my head what I think of when I see those 2 essay questions. But I want to hear what you have to say. So make sure that you really sit down and think about those questions so you can compose a good answer for whichever one I ask you. Okay? And as always, guys, remember that if you don't actually study this information that we just went over, it's not going to do you any good. You're not going to remember it if you only watch this video one time and then go to bed and forget all about it. So please study, quiz yourself, look over this stuff multiple times, and you will be surprised how well you're going to do on this test. So good luck, study hard, see you on Wednesday.